Morning and welcome to a tutorial about how to rig a humanoid character using Rigify. And also I'm hoping if we have enough time we'll get a little bit into the NLA editor in Blender and creating a walk cycle for a character like this. So we're going to start off just kind of assuming that you've already modeled a character. I've got my screencast keys turned on down here so that you'll be able to see what buttons I'm pushing, but I'll try to explain as I go along sort of what I'm doing. So looking at this character from a few different sides, first of all, you'll see that the character is almost in a sitting position. Traditionally, a lot of characters end up in a T-pose, which means, you know, from a front view at least, the arms would be straight out this way. And that's a little bit awkward for animating because generally, I mean, the mesh will bunch up or stretch as you deform it, as you use an armature to bend it from its initial position. And if its initial position is a T-pose, you know, normally that's not exactly halfway through the range of travel for a shoulder, for instance. That's up farther than halfway. This 45-degree angle here is a little bit closer to a halfway kind of reasonable range of motion for normal things that you're likely to do. So you see a lot of really odd shoulder deformities when a character is created using a T-pose. So this is a little closer to an A pose, which means the arms are down at a 45, but you'll notice the elbows are also bent here. And that, basically, this is just kind of a relaxed position where I've positioned the arms and the knees and the hip joints and the feet kind of, you know, at a fairly neutral bend where they're not bent to an extreme, but they're also not straight. So the idea there is to minimize the amount of deformation that happens when you bend one of the joints of your armature. So starting off here, we've got our armature. In terms of the mesh, the eyes are actually separate pieces here. As a matter of fact, the eyes, if you zoom in really close, you'll see the eyes are made up of two different pieces. There's an outer eye and an inner eye. And the inner eye is a child of the outer eye. The reason I constructed this that way, if we look at a rendered view here, is that basically I want to be able to construct the lens of the eye, that's the outer eye portion, the lens in such a way that it can actually refract and show the inner eye in a realistic way. So that's kind of what's happening here, is basically the outer eye is essentially very similar to just a glass shader. And it's probably not refracting perfectly yet, but it's a little closer to what I want than, and it looks a lot more realistic than if you just kind of paint the irises onto the outside of the eye. So the eyes are separate pieces, and right now the hair is actually a separate piece, and this hair has a multi-resolution, or sorry, a subdivision surface modifier on it. If we were to look at the hair as it actually is supposed to look, it's a lot more detailed, but I like to turn the detail down in my viewport so that, you know, things stay fairly responsive and snappy here. Likewise, there's a subdivision surface modifier on the mesh of the body, but I have the view detail turned down to 1, whereas it will render at a subdivision level of 2. And honestly, before I ever render this, I'd probably swap that out for a multi-resolution modifier and maybe do a little bit of sculpting. But that's not really what this tutorial is about, so let's get to rigging this thing. So I'm just going to go to a front view. I'm going to verify that my 3D cursor is in fact in the very center of my scene, and it is. If it's not, you press Shift S and click on Cursor to Center. And when this character was initially modeled, it was in T-pose. And the feet were just perfectly flat on the ground right here on at 0 on the Z-axis. So I picked the feet up rather than bringing the entire model down, because when I rig this thing, as I straighten the feet, I would like them to sit perfectly at 0 on the Z-axis. So that's why she's kind of floating in the air right now. So I'm going to, first of all, since we're using Rigify, you'll want to go to your user preferences and go to your add-ons and just type rig over here, and this add-on here, rigging Rigify, I'm using Blender 2.79b. You'll want a checkbox next to that, and then to click Save User Settings. The other thing you'll want to do, and I'll refer again to this a little later, is you'll want to go to the File section here, and you'll want to put a checkbox here next to Auto Run Python Scripts. There's a feature on Rigify that we're going to use that depends on having that checkbox checked, so you'll want that checked. Then click Save User Settings and close out of your user preferences. At that point, if you use Shift-A and click on Armature here, you'll see one of our top options here is the Human Meta Rig. So click on that, and you can see that that brings in this skeleton for us. So I'm going to grab my mesh and I'm going to scale it down to fit that skeleton just a little better, because the odds are that it won't be a perfect fit yet. So I'm going to deselect everything and just do a box selection. I'm going to make sure that I get my eyes and hair here. And then I'm going to scale this down, and I'm going to try to line things up about, oh, I should mention, I am scaling from the 3D cursor. That's this little guy right here, rather than the median point, so that everything kind of comes down toward that central point. And you may not need to do that, just depending on how your setup is, but for my particular setup here, that's what works best. So, oops, I deselected everything. There we go. Undo my deselection, and I'm just going to scale everything. So really, I'm going to just kind of look at the corners of these eyes and get them about lined up. Okay, and that's starting to look about right. Like, we can work from there. So from here, what we need to do is we need to select our armature, and over here under my object data, I'm going to click on Xray under groups, Xray, so that I can see these bones even when they're inside of the mesh, which ultimately that's where I want them, right? The other thing I'm going to do is with this armature selected, I'm going to tap T to open this little side menu here. I'm going to tab into edit mode. This option is only going to be available in edit mode. And then I'm going to go to options and check Xaxis Mirror. And that's going to cut the amount of translation and rotation work and scaling that I have to do in half, because basically what that means is if I grab one bone on one side, it's going to move the bone opposite that side across the x-axis identically. So make sure that's checked. It'll save you a lot of work, and it'll keep your model precise rather than just kind of eyeballing symmetry. Okay, so I've got that checked. I'm in edit mode on my armature here. And let's just kind of see how things are lining up here. Let's see. I'm actually going to deselect all, and I'm going to move my model forward a little bit there. Just kind of get things a little bit closer, and then select the armature again, tab into edit mode, and I'm going to start lining things up. I always try to do this sort of thing in a named orthographic viewport. So right now I'm in right ortho. I tap 3 on the number pad to get to that viewport. I'm just going to grab a knee and put it about where I think the knee goes. That's probably a good place to start. This little guy here, you might think that's the heel, but it's actually the ankle. So make sure that goes where the ankle should be. And then these are the toes. So you'll want to make sure that those are placed where the foot should actually bend. You don't want them to be like up here, because if you bend a foot there, it would be breaking bones, right? So that's not happy. And then this guy will later become an IK handle. So I'm just going to leave that underneath the heel, roughly where it kind of wanted to be in the first place. Okay, so you can see now that on the y-axis and the z-axis, I've got these 4 joints here lined up. But in the x-axis, they're way off. So I'm just going to go to my front orthographic viewport and tap G, X. And I know these are lined up in Y. That's why I'm constraining my axis right here. So I'm moving them in the x-axis, GX, GX, GX. And that way, when I go back to my right orthographic viewport, you can see they're still in the same positions as they were. They're still where they should have been. And that works pretty well for me. Okay, so that's reasonably good on the legs. I think I might move the hips out just a little. There we go, the hip bones. All right. So now let's work on the spine. Actually, let's take these. These I think are actually the hip bones. I'm going to move them forward just a little. And it's funny, you know, we often think of a person's spine as being right along the ridge of their back because we can feel something bony there. But really, what you're feeling there are processes coming off of your vertebrae, and your actual spine is much further inside of your back than you might think. So I'm going to try to reflect that a little bit. I find that if topology follows muscles, and if an armature follows, you know, an actual natural skeleton as much as possible, things tend to work reasonably well out of the box. Okay, and I'm gonna, these represent the clavicle, the collarbone, so I'm gonna move those up. Okay, and let's see, I'm gonna move these breastbones a little closer to where they probably ought to be. What's going on here? I've got like a plane or something in the way. There we go. All right, and the shoulders. Let's align those from a top view. Now the hands, the hands can get really messed up if I start just sort of grabbing like the base and tips of bones and moving them around one at a time. So I'm going to actually kind of select the whole hand, and I'm going to change my rotation back to the median point here and just kind of get that roughly in place as a whole, and then I'll position all the parts of it a little later. Okay, let's see how we're looking from a side view here. So I can see my shoulders are way too low. Let's move those in the Z-axis. Okay, so we're starting to get there, and now we can start maybe playing with the individual parts of the joints here. So the hands, this is actually a lot easier if your model is in a T-pose. Whoops, I forgot. There's a couple of joints here, so I like to keep them together, just sort of, you know, keep everything as close to its default as possible. So I come in and just select them together in wireframe view so that I can select through things. But this is a lot easier in a T-pose because the hand is flat, and you know, like here where the hand is not really planar to any one axis, so it gets a little funny kind of trying to move this around. Let's see, that probably ought to be up there. There we go. Trying to move this around and see what's actually going on, because, like, you know, look how weird that looks from a different angle. So really, kind of the way to, you just sort of have to pick your battles one at a time here and say, okay, I'm looking down the z-axis here, and I'm going to line everything up on that axis. And then when I get that reasonably well placed, I can look at another axis and kind of fix everything that's wrong from there. And pretty soon here, I'm probably going to turn off. Here I'm constraining my axis to the z-axis because I'm happy with X and Y at this point. I'm probably going to turn off the Xray view here pretty soon. Whoop. Again, select both of those because it can be helpful to see at what point the bones start vanishing into the mesh here to make sure that things actually are where you think they are. GZ. This is another one of those points where you start to think, I am so glad I have Xaxis mirroring on, so I don't have to go and do this to the other hand on the other side. So let's have a look and see if we turn off Xray. Okay, and you can see we're actually pretty close here, but we are a little off in a few places. So that could go down inside of the mesh. This certainly could. Let's see how close to the surface that is. That probably is good. Okay. Put that down inside. And I'm actually pretty happy with this so far. Let's look at the thumb. The thumb's always its own kind of challenge. Oh, it looks like we actually got the thumb pretty well. Okay. I think I'm happy with the hands. All right, now that kind of leaves the face, which is a pain. But I'll probably just stop talking and time-lapse this a little bit so you don't have to sit through it. So here I go. Okay, so I've got the face reasonably well lined up, but I want to talk very briefly about the eyes. So the eyes are kind of a special case because the eyes that I've built here, they are not perfectly round. If you look at them from the side view, you can see that the lens protrudes just a little bit, and that's on purpose. That's realistic. That's what an actual eye does. But they are based on a sphere, and so there is actually, if this lens weren't protruding, they would have a proper center point here, within this edge loop, basically. In the center of that, that's where the eye should, that's the point around which the eye should rotate when it moves, so that it doesn't kind of bulge out of the eyelids in an odd way as it rotates. If you rotate something circular that's off axis, from anything but its center point, it'll have a side that's sticking out more. It's like when you spin a frisbee on your finger or something like that. One side's out of the center of gravity, basically. So I need these eyes to rotate around that point. So the eye bones need to be lined up very, very carefully. So let's. I'm going to hide the main part of the mesh here, so that I can just deal with these eye bones for a second. So it's actually pretty easy to do this. If I tab into edit mode on this eyeball, and you can see that I've option clicked on this central edge loop here so that I have the whole thing selected, I can just place my 3D cursor, which is currently still in the center of my scene down here. I can place my 3D cursor right in the center of this thing, with Shift D, or sorry, not Shift D. Make sure you undo that. Shift S, and then placing the cursor to selected. And it will just look at everything I have selected and place the cursor in the center of that. Okay, so now tab out of edit mode there, and I can tab into edit mode on my skeleton here and grab the base of the eye bone. And just to be sure, I'm going to come over here to my bone. Okay, eye.l, yes, that is correct. So grab the base of this and tap Shift S and move the selection to the cursor. You can see that that base is now exactly on the 3D cursor. So we're going to do the same thing with the tip. Tab out of edit mode, tab into edit mode on the eyeball here, and I'm going to click on this vertex that's just at the tip of the lens and do the same thing. Shift S and put my cursor to the selection, tab out, tab into edit mode on the armature here, select the tip of the eye bone again and Shift S, selection to cursor. Okay, and my eye bones are now lined up exactly where they need to be. Okay, so just as a precaution, I'm going to tap Shift S again and put my cursor back to the center because that's where I usually tend to assume it is. And let's Option H to unhide our mesh, and our armature is now lined up basically where we want it. Okay, so these bones, they're a little bit twisted compared to the lay of the finger. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, and when you tab into edit mode over here in your properties panel, you get this roll for each bone, and I'm going to correct that roll. This will save me a lot of headache later on if I just do this now. And thankfully, this also, Xaxis mirroring, works with this. Another good thing, by the way, is to show your axes while you're doing this and make sure that you're not rolling them 90 degrees off from how they should be. So my Z is always up and down. X is going to be the direction that these fingers should actually bend. And I've got a little bit of weirdness over there too, haven't I? Okay. So X should be sticking out to the side there, as it is. Okay, so we've got the roll of those bones corrected. One thing we've got to do before we generate our rig is we need to go into the bone properties panel of these of this armature, and we need to go into pose mode and select the first finger bone of each finger. Scroll down, and under Rigify type, we need to change each of these from limbs.simpletentacle to limbs.superfinger. This is I think, a much better control for the fingers. This will not be mirrored, so we have to do it on each and every finger, all 10 of them, both sides. And this is the thing that would not work properly if we didn't have that auto-run Python scripts checkbox enabled in our user preferences. So we've just got to go in and make each of these, just change them up. And that should get us ready to generate our rig finally. So now in object mode, I'm going to go back to my armature properties panel over here and click on generate rig. We'll get our spinning beach ball and it'll think for a second. And now we have all these widgets. We're actually done with these bones, so we can tap H to hide them. Select the widgets that were generated here, and now we go into pose mode, and we're going to select all, and we're going to hide those as well. And again, in our armature properties panel, this guy here, we're going to shift click on this third layer from the right, and you can see that a new armature, a new set of bones is now visible that looks just like the one we just hid, except that the bones are all green, which means they have constraints applied to them. Now these are the bones that we're actually going to parent to our mesh. So we'll click on Xray, and we can click our mesh here, and then click on a bone. Let's go into object mode on that thing, sorry. Click on mesh, click on armature, of course Ctrl+P, and we are going to set parent to armature deform with automatic weights. So that's tabbed in, it's an under subset of armature deform. So we'll click on with automatic weights, let that generate our automatic weight painting and our vertex groups, and then that is now parented. Okay, next thing we need to do, we need to parent our hair, actually, and that's a little bit easier. So select your armature here and go into pose mode. And we're just going to parent the hair just to this head bone here, the skull, which they actually call it spine.006. So select that bone in pose mode. Then I'm going to come and select the hair, which deselects the bone, and then shift-click to select that bone, Ctrl+P, and I'm just going to parent the hair to this bone, just this one bone. Okay, now we're going to do a similar thing to the eyes, but you can see that, funny enough, our eye bones, the ones we actually lined up with the eyeballs, they're not visible. So I am now going to go back to my armature properties panel, and I'm going to hide these bones we just made visible, and the next layer to the right, I'm going to open that, and you can see that our eye bone is in fact in there, and there's a whole bunch of them. You know, we need to kind of figure out which one we actually need. So just to kind of clear up the visual confusion here, I'm going to hide the mesh and hide the hair, then select the armature again. From a top view here, it's going to be this one that's straight down, but just to verify, to double check, we click on the bone properties, and sure enough, that's I.L, MCH I.L. Let's get rid of this floor plane thing so that we can see a little better. Okay, so I select that bone, and I'm going to do the exact same thing as I did with the hair. So select the eye, shift-click to select the bone, Control-P, and set parent to bone. Then do the same thing with the other eye. Let's verify that this is, okay, this is I.R. So select the eye, shift-click to select the bone, Control-P, bone. Okay, the eye is now parented to the eye bones, so that's what we need there. And I'm going to expand our rig here and unhide the girl mesh and the hair. Then go back into my armature properties panel, and I can shift click once again on this layer, and I can press Option H to unhide all my widgets. Okay, and at this point things should be parented, so we can kind of check out how things work here. We can rotate, you can see the hair and the eyes are moving with the head, so that's good. We can open the jaw. We can grab the IK solvers for each foot. And we can move the foot down so that she's standing. Matter of fact, I can grab both IK solvers at once. Move those down so that she's standing. And this is actually working reasonably well. There's a couple little tweaks I would suggest doing. There are tongue bones with this armature, and since we just did automatic weights with our parenting, those tongue bones, for instance, will be influencing things that they shouldn't be. So if I click on my mesh and go into weight paint mode, I can expand my list of vertex groups here. Let's just start at the bottom and use our arrow keys to kind of go up and watch for vertex groups that are either labeled tongue or that look like they're influencing something that they shouldn't be. Okay, we're starting to get over into the face here. These are all nose, so that's probably okay. Lip. Jaw, brow. It's actually looking pretty good. Okay, there's my first, there's a tongue vertex group, and you can see that it's got a lot of influence on the throat. So let's open our tool palette here, and under draw I'm going to change this from blur to subtract, and I'm just going to paint. Let's turn our strength up. I'm just going to paint that influence out. I really don't want, you know, one thing also to do over here is before I do that, I should check X mirror on symmetry just to make sure that we keep our weight painting symmetrical. Okay, let's paint that influence out. The next tongue one, jaw. Oh, there's another tongue. And it looks like it has some influence on the front lip, which it probably shouldn't. So let's paint that out. The ears are probably fine. The eyelids, we'll probably have to come in and tweak them a little bit later. Okay. So at this point, we will exit weight painting mode, go back to object mode, and you can see now that we can manipulate our rig pretty well. One thing we can do that is probably worth mentioning here at the end, if you scroll all the way down in your properties panel, when you're in pose mode with these widgets selected, you can actually show and hide different sets of widgets. For instance, I'm using the inverse kinematics solvers right now on our legs and arms. So you can grab this kind of hand paddle here and you can move things around. That's inverse kinematics. There are also forward kinematics solvers here. So, you know, if I want to use forward kinematics on the arms, I've got a slider here. And that allows me to just kind of come in here and say, okay, we're going to start at the shoulder basically and work out, as opposed to using inverse kinematics where we start at the hand and it sort of chain links everything back. So if I'm using one or the other, I can actually hide the set of controls that I'm not using. So I can come down here and shift click, for instance, on the FK arm controls, and they kind of get out of the way. If I'm not going to be tweaking the arms right now, then I can move those, and I can remove the torso tweaks and the leg tweaks and the leg FKs since I'm using the IKs, and that sort of simplifies things. I can also turn off the secondary facial controls if I'm just doing very basic controls for now. And that gives me the ability to kind of keep things simple, streamlined. I can always turn them back on when I want to use them. But anyway, I'm pretty happy with that. So let's call that part 1 of this tutorial, and then the next part will go into creating a walk cycle and a run cycle, and working with the nonlinear animation editor. Thanks for watching.